The wind howled like a wounded animal across the Wyoming prairie, carrying with it the bitter promise of another harsh winter. Clara Whitfield stood at the frost-covered window of her weathered cabin, watching the gray clouds gather over the distant mountains. Her calloused hands gripped the wooden frame as she calculated how much firewood remained stacked against the wall outside. Not enough. Never enough. 2 years had passed since Thomas died, leaving her alone on this unforgiving stretch of land. The consumption had taken him slowly, cruelly, until nothing remained but memories and debts. Now, at 26, Clara faced each dawn with a stubborn determination that had become her only companion. The townspeople called her foolish for staying, a young widow clinging to dead dreams. Let them talk. This land was all she had left of Thomas, and she'd defend it with her last breath. She pulled her worn shawl tighter and turned from the window. The cabin's single room held everything she owned: a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed pushed against the wall, and the cast-iron stove that fought a losing battle against the cold. Above the mantel hung Thomas's rifle, cleaned and loaded, a reminder that danger lurked beyond her door in more forms than just the weather. The morning chores couldn't wait for warmer thoughts. Clara stepped into her boots, laced them tight, and pushed open the door. The wind struck her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and numbing her face within seconds. Ice crystals danced in the air, sparkling deceptively in the weak morning light. The water bucket by the door had frozen solid overnight, its surface glazed with patterns that might have been beautiful if they didn't represent another hardship to overcome. The well stood 50 yards from the cabin, its wooden frame groaning under the weight of accumulated ice. Clara picked up the iron bar she kept nearby for breaking through the frozen surface. Each strike sent vibrations up her arms, but she worked methodically, steadily, until the ice cracked and fell away in chunks. The rope burned her hands even through her mittens as she lowered the bucket, listening for the splash that meant she'd found water. As she hauled up the filled bucket, movement on the horizon caught her eye. A lone rider approached from the east, his silhouette dark against the pale sky. Clara's heart quickened. Visitors were rare and rarely brought good news. She set the bucket down carefully and moved closer to the cabin. Within easy reach of the door and Thomas's rifle, the rider drew nearer, his horse's breath steaming in the cold air. Something about the way he sat in the saddle, relaxed yet alert, stirred a distant memory. The broad shoulders, the tilt of his hat, the way he guided his mount with subtle shifts of weight rather than harsh commands. Recognition struck her like lightning. Caleb Morrison. She hadn't seen him since Thomas's funeral, when he'd stood at the back of the small gathering, hat in hand, his weathered face etched with genuine sorrow. Before that, he'd been Thomas's friend, another cowboy working the cattle drives, sharing campfire stories and dreams of someday settling down. Clara remembered how his presence had always filled a room, how his rare smiles had transformed his stern features, how his deep voice had carried across the prairie wind. Now he approached her home, and Clara couldn't decide if she should feel relieved or alarmed. Caleb reined in his horse a respectful distance from the cabin, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. He touched the brim of his hat in greeting but didn't dismount, waiting for her acknowledgement. The years had carved new lines around his eyes, and his face bore the deep tan of a man who lived under open skies. His coat was trail-worn but clean, his boots polished despite the dust of travel. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, his voice carrying that same low rumble she remembered. "I heard you were still here." Clara straightened her spine, lifting her chin. "Mr. Morrison, what brings you to these parts?" He studied her for a moment, taking in her thin frame, the patches on her dress, the determined set of her jaw. "Passing through. Thought I'd check on Thomas's widow. Make sure you were managing." "I manage fine," she replied, the words sharper than intended. She'd grown tired of people checking on her, their concern always laced with judgment. A young woman alone, fighting to keep a failing ranch, defying every social convention. Their pity stung worse than their criticism. Caleb nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. I can see that, though your woodpile looks mighty low for the winter ahead. Heat rose in Clara's cheeks despite the cold. As I said, I manage. A silence stretched between them, filled only by the wind and the restless shuffling of Caleb's horse. He looked past her to the cabin, the meager outbuildings, the fence that needed mending. When his gaze returned to her, something had shifted in his expression. I'll be staying in town for a spell, he said, if you need anything. I don't. The words came out hard and final. Clara had learned that accepting help came with a price, whether in obligations or assumptions about what a widow might offer in return. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he merely touched his hat again. Ma'am. He turned his horse and rode away, his back straight in the saddle. Clara watched until he disappeared over a rise, then realized she was trembling, not from cold, but from the unexpected upheaval of seeing him again. She grabbed the water bucket and hurried inside, slamming the door harder than necessary. For the rest of the day, she threw herself into chores with renewed vigor, mending harnesses, patching another hole in the roof, checking the meager stores in a root cellar. Anything to avoid thinking about Caleb Morrison and the way his presence had stirred something she'd thought buried with Thomas. As evening approached, the news she'd been dreading arrived with Samuel Turner, the general store owner's son. The boy's horse was lathered with sweat despite the cold, his young face grave with importance. Pa sent me to warn folks, he said, accepting the cup of water Clara offered. Cattle thieves hit the Brazier spread last night. Took 50 head and shot Tom Brazier when he tried to stop them. He'll live, but barely. Clara's blood ran cold. The Brazier ranch lay only 15 miles north. How many were there? Tom said at least 6, maybe more. They wore masks, but he recognized Jake Tolliver's bay mare. You know Jake. Used to work for Mr. Garrett before he got run out of town for rustling. She knew Jake Tolliver. All right. A mean drunk with cruel eyes and a nasty reputation. If he was riding with cattle thieves now, they were more dangerous than typical rustlers. Pa says you should come to town until this blows over. Samuel continued. A woman alone out here. Thank you for the warning. Clara interrupted. Tell your father I appreciate his concern. The boy looked uncertain but didn't argue. After he left, Clara barred the door and checked Thomas's rifle again. She had 12 bullets. If trouble came calling, she'd need every one. Night fell like a black curtain across the prairie. Clara sat by the stove, listening to every sound. The wind rattling the windows, the settling of old wood, the distant howl of coyotes. She thought of Caleb Morrison in town, probably warm in the hotel, sharing whiskey and stories with other cowboys. Had he heard about the rustlers? Did he care? She shook her head, angry at herself for wondering. She'd survived 2 years without him, without anyone. She'd survive this too. But as the temperature dropped and frost crept across the windows, Clara couldn't shake the memory of his eyes, the quiet strength in his presence, the way he'd said he was staying in town, like a promise, like a threat, like something she didn't dare name. The prairie stretched endless and empty around her cabin, and for the first time in months, Clara felt the true weight of her isolation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles to fight, but tonight, with danger prowling the territory and winter closing in, she allowed herself one moment of weakness. She whispered Thomas's name into the darkness, but it was Caleb Morrison's face that haunted her as she finally drifted into uneasy sleep. The loaded rifle within arm's reach. The morning arrived with a crash. Clara jolted awake to find her fence gate hanging off its hinges, banging against the post in the wind. She dressed quickly and rushed outside, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The damage was worse than it looked from the window. Several fence posts had rotted through at the base, and a section of wire lay twisted on the frozen ground. She stood there, hands on her hips, calculating the work ahead. Without proper fencing, what few chickens she had left would scatter, and come spring, she'd have no way to contain the vegetable garden that kept her fed through summer. The weight of endless repairs pressed down on her shoulders. That's a 2-person job. Clara spun around, her hand instinctively moving toward the cabin where the rifle waited. Caleb Morrison stood by the broken gate, his horse ground-tied nearby. He'd approached so quietly she hadn't heard him over the wind. "I told you I don't need help," she said, though the words lacked yesterday's venom. "I can see that." He examined the damaged posts with a practiced eye. "But I've got nothing pressing today, and I never could abide seeing good fence go to waste." Before she could protest further, he was already pulling tools from his saddlebags. Clara watched, torn between pride and practicality. The fence needed fixing, and she knew it would take her days working alone. "I can't pay you," she said finally. Caleb glanced up from where he was testing the stability of a post. "Didn't ask for pay. Thomas was my friend. This is what friends do." The mention of Thomas settled between them like a physical presence. Clara remembered now. Caleb had helped Thomas build this very fence the summer before he got sick. They'd worked through the blazing heat, sharing water from the same canteen, laughing at some joke she couldn't quite recall. "All right," she heard herself say, "but I'll provide lunch." They worked in companionable silence as the sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the prairie. Caleb's movements were efficient, economical, the mark of a man who'd spent his life working with his hands. Clara found herself matching his rhythm, holding posts steady while he hammered, stretching wire taut while he secured it. By midday, they'd replaced 3 posts and restrung half the fence line. Clara's arms ached, but it was a good ache, the kind that came from honest labor. She left Caleb finishing a section while she went inside to prepare lunch. Her stores were meager: cornbread, beans, a bit of salt pork. But she made do. When she called him in, Caleb removed his hat at the door and wiped his boots carefully on the mat. Such small courtesies, but they mattered. Too many men would have tracked mud across her floor without a thought. "Coffee's hot," she said, pouring 2 cups from the pot on the stove. "Much obliged." He wrapped his hands around the tin cup, savoring the warmth. "You make it strong. Thomas always said you made the best coffee in the territory." He was biased. "Sssss." Clara set the plates on the table, trying not to think about how natural this felt, sharing a meal with someone after so many solitary days. They ate without much conversation, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. Through the window, Clara could see the repaired fence, already looking sturdier than it had in months. Pride warred with gratitude in her chest. "Heard about the Brazier Ranch?" Caleb said eventually, pushing his empty plate away. "You must have heard too, way news travels out here. Samuel Turner came by yesterday. You planning on heading to town?" Clara's spine stiffened. "This is my home. Not questioning that, just saying, sometimes the smart move is to step back until trouble passes. And sometimes trouble doesn't pass. Sometimes it settles in like winter, and you either face it or lose everything." She met his gaze steadily. "I won't lose this place." Caleb studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Thomas always said you were tougher than rawhide." Guess he knew what he was talking about. After lunch, they returned to the fence. The afternoon sun offered little warmth, but the work kept them moving. Clara found herself stealing glances at Caleb as he worked. The years on the trail had hardened him, turned the young cowboy she remembered into a man who moved with quiet confidence. His hands were scarred but gentle with the tools, his focus complete on whatever task lay before him. "Where have you been?" she asked suddenly, surprising herself. Since the funeral." Caleb drove in another nail before answering. "Here and there. Worked a spread down in Texas for a while. Tried my hand at mining in Colorado. Nothing stuck." He paused, tested the post's stability, kept thinking about settling down, but nowhere felt right. Why come back here? He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, man gets tired of drifting, starts thinking about what matters, what he left behind. He glanced at her, then away. "Heard you were still here, still fighting. Figured maybe I could help." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning Clara wasn't ready to examine. She turned her attention back to the wire, pulling it tight with perhaps more force than necessary. as the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. They finished the last section of fence. Clara stepped back to survey their work, satisfaction warming her despite the dropping temperature. "Thank you," she said simply. "Like I said, it's what friends do." Caleb gathered his tools, movements deliberately slow. "I'm thinking of buying the old Henshaw place. You know it?" Clara knew it well, 40 acres adjoining her property to the south, abandoned these past 5 years since old man Henshaw died. Good land, with water rights and decent grazing. "That's ambitious for a drifting cowboy," she said carefully. "Maybe I'm tired of drifting." He swung into the saddle with easy grace, then looked down at her. "I'll be back tomorrow to check that fence. Weather like this, posts can shift overnight." "That's not necessary." "Nevertheless." He touched his hat brim, that same respectful gesture, but his eyes held something that made her heart skip. Then he was riding away, his silhouette dark against the painted sky. Clara stood by her repaired fence, watching until he disappeared. The prairie stretched endlessly around her, but somehow it didn't feel quite as empty as it had that morning. She shook her head at her own foolishness and headed inside to prepare for another cold night. But as she passed the window, she caught herself looking south, toward the Henshaw place, wondering what it would mean to have Caleb Morrison for a neighbor, wondering why the thought didn't frighten her as much as it should. That night, as she lay in her narrow bed listening to the wind test the new fence posts, Clara remembered something Thomas had said during his final days. "Don't bury yourself with me. Clara, girl, this land needs life, not just survival." She'd been too grief-stricken to understand then. Now, with the ghost of Caleb's presence still lingering in her small cabin, she began to wonder if Thomas had known something she was only beginning to grasp. The moon rose full and bright, casting silver light across the prairie. Through her window, Clara could see the pine forest in the distance, dark and mysterious against the star-filled sky. The wind sang through the trees, a lonesome sound that usually brought melancholy. Tonight, it sounded almost like a promise. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The rustlers were still out there. Winter was closing in, and the townspeople would certainly have opinions about Caleb Morrison working on the widow Whitfield's property. But for now, Clara allowed herself to feel something she hadn't experienced in 2 long years: hope. The tracks appeared at dawn, boot prints circling the cabin, stopping at windows, testing the barn door. Clara discovered them when she went to feed the chickens, and her blood turned to ice. Someone had been here during the night, close enough to peer through her windows while she slept. She followed the tracks with growing dread. 3 men, maybe 4, their horses tied back by the grove of cottonwoods. They'd taken their time, studying her property, learning her routines. The message was clear: "We know you're alone." Clara forced herself to complete the morning chores. Though her hands shook as she scattered grain for the chickens, every shadow might hide a threat, every sound could signal their return. She kept Thomas's rifle within reach, checking the horizon constantly. By noon, her nerves were stretched taut as fence wire. When hoofbeats approached, she grabbed the rifle and positioned herself behind the cabin door. But it was Caleb's voice that called out, steady and calm. "Mrs. Whitfield, it's Caleb Morrison." Relief flooded through her as she lowered the weapon. He dismounted near the porch, his expression darkening as he noticed the tracks. "When?" he asked simply. "Last night. I found them this morning." Caleb studied the boot prints with the focused intensity of a man who'd tracked both cattle and men across unforgiving terrain. He followed their path around the cabin, jaw tightening at each discovery. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an edge of controlled anger. "They were testing your defenses, looking for weak spots." He pointed to marks near the window. "See here? One of them stood for a good while, watching." The violation of it made Clara's skin crawl. "Should I go to town? Report it to Sheriff Watson?" "Watson's worthless, and you know it. Man couldn't find his own horse in a corral." Caleb's disgust was evident. "No. What you need is someone here at night. I'll bed down in the barn." I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm offering. His brown eyes met hers, steady and determined. Thomas would haunt me if I let anything happen to you. Pride warred with practicality in Clara's chest. She'd fought so hard to prove she could manage alone. But these tracks changed everything. These weren't random drifters. They were scouts, planning something. All right, she said quietly, just until this passes. That evening, as purple shadows stretched across the prairie, Caleb helped her secure the property. They moved the chickens into the barn, barred the windows, and positioned water buckets in case of fire. Working together, they created a defensive position that would at least slow any attackers. As night fell, Clara insisted on bringing blankets and a hot meal to the barn. She found Caleb had already made a serviceable camp in an empty stall, positioning himself with clear sight lines to both doors. "You don't have to do this," she said, setting down the plate of stew and cornbread. "Yes, I do." He accepted the food gratefully. Man can't stand by when wolves circle. They sat in the barn's dim light, sharing the meal in companionable silence. The lantern cast dancing shadows on the walls, and somewhere in the rafters, a barn owl rustled its feathers. Despite the circumstances, Clara felt safer than she had in months. "Tell me about Texas," she said, surprising herself with the request. Caleb leaned back against a hay bale, his features softening. "Hot as Satan's forge in summer, cold enough to freeze your thoughts in winter. Worked for an outfit near San Antonio, running longhorns up to Kansas. Good money, hard living. Why leave?" He was quiet for a moment, staring into the lantern flame. "Got tired of being just another hired hand. Man reaches a certain age, starts wanting something of his own, land, maybe purpose." He glanced at her. Roots. The word hung between them, loaded with possibility. Clara found herself wondering what kind of roots a man like Caleb Morrison might want to put down. "Thomas talked about you sometimes," she said softly. "Said you were the best cowhand he'd ever worked with. Said you had a way with horses that was almost magic. Thomas was generous with his praise." Caleb's smile was tinged with sadness. "He talked about you too. You know, couldn't go 2 days on the trail without mentioning something. Clara's cornbread, Clara's laugh, Clara's way of seeing straight through a man's foolishness." Heat rose in her cheeks. "He exaggerated. Did he?" Caleb's gaze held hers for a long moment before he looked away. "I should check the perimeter." After he left, Clara sat alone in the barn, processing the undercurrents in their conversation. She'd been so focused on survival these past 2 years. She'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen as more than a widow, more than a burden or an oddity. The night passed without incident, though Clara barely slept, aware of every sound. When dawn broke clear and cold, she found Caleb already up, studying fresh tracks near the well. "They came back," he said grimly, bolder this time. "One of them tried the barn door." Fear knotted in her stomach. "While you were inside?" "While I was inside." His expression was dangerous. "They're testing more than defenses now. They're seeing what they're up against." The implications chilled her more than the morning wind. These men knew she wasn't alone anymore, and they'd still come prowling. "I need to go to town," Caleb announced. "Get supplies, ammunition, maybe shake a few trees, see what falls out." He paused. "Come with me. I can't leave the stock. The stock will be fine for a few hours. Besides, might do good for folks to see you're not alone out here anymore." Clara understood his meaning. In a small town, perception mattered almost as much as reality. If people saw her with Caleb, word would spread. Maybe it would give the rustlers pause. They rode to town together. Clara on Thomas's old mare, Caleb on his rangy gelding. The journey passed quickly, filled with careful conversation about safer topics. The coming winter, the price of grain, the new schoolmarm from back east. Millbrook appeared on the horizon, its cluster of wooden buildings huddled against the vastness of the prairie. As they rode down Main Street, Clara felt the weight of watching eyes. Curtains twitched, conversations paused, and she could practically hear the gossip mills starting to grind. At the general store, Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows climbed nearly to her hairline when they entered together. The older woman's mouth pursed like she'd bitten into a lemon. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said coolly. "Mr. Morrison." "Ma'am," Caleb replied, touching his hat brim before moving toward the ammunition display. Clara focused on her small list. Flour, coffee, salt. Trying to ignore Mrs. Henderson's drilling stare. But when she reached for her worn purse to pay, the shopkeeper couldn't contain herself. "Interesting company you're keeping these days," Mrs. Henderson observed, her tone dripping disapproval. "Mr. Morrison has been kind enough to help with some repairs." Clara replied evenly, "I'm sure he has." The woman's implications hung heavy as storm clouds. "A widow must be careful about appearances, my dear. People talk. People always talk," Clara said, her patience finally fraying, usually when they have nothing better to do. She paid for her goods and left, cheeks burning. Outside, she found Caleb talking with a group of cowboys near the hitching post. As she approached, one of them, a rough-looking man with a scar across his jaw, made a comment too low for her to hear. Caleb's posture shifted subtly, becoming dangerous. "You'd do well to watch your tongue, Garrett," he said, voice deadly quiet. The scarred man, this must be the Mr. Garrett, who'd employed Jake Tolliver, laughed unpleasantly. "Just making conversation? Morrison, no law against that." "No," Caleb agreed. "But there's laws against other things, like rustling, like threatening widow women." Garrett's eyes narrowed. "That's a serious accusation." "It surely is." The tension stretched taut between them until Garrett finally spat tobacco juice near Caleb's boot and turned away. "Come on, boys. Air's getting a mite too righteous around here." As they mounted up to leave town, Clara noticed Caleb's jaw was still rigid with anger. "What did he say?" she asked quietly. "Nothing worth repeating." He guided his horse closer to hers. "But Garrett's nervous. Means we're on the right track." They rode home through the afternoon light, both lost in thought. As her cabin came into view, Clara felt the now familiar mix of relief and dread. Safe for the moment, but for how long? That night, as moonlight painted the prairie silver and wolves howled in the distant mountains, Caleb again took his post in the barn. Clara lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, acutely aware that only thin walls separated them. She thought of his steady presence, his quiet strength, the way he'd defended her honor in town without her even asking. Dangerous thoughts for a widow, dangerous feelings for a woman who'd sworn to need no one. But as sleep finally claimed her, Clara admitted a truth she'd been fighting since Caleb Morrison rode back into her life. Sometimes being strong meant knowing when to stop standing alone. The attack came at midday, when the sun hung high and merciless in a cloudless sky. Clara was drawing water from the well when the first shot rang out, splintering the wooden beam inches from her head. She dropped the bucket and ran for the cabin as more bullets whined through the air like angry hornets. "Get inside!" Caleb's voice roared from the barn. She heard the sharp crack of his rifle answering their fire. Clara burst through the cabin door and grabbed Thomas's rifle from above the mantel. Her hands were steady despite the thunder of her heartbeat. Through the window, she counted 5 riders spread in a half circle around the property, their faces hidden behind bandanas. They were shooting at the barn now, trying to pin Caleb down. One rider broke from the group, spurring his horse toward the chicken coop. Clara recognized the bay mare, Jake Tolliver, just as Tom Brazier had said. She raised the rifle, sighted carefully, and squeezed the trigger. The shot went wide, but close enough to make Tolliver veer away. Cursing, the barn door flew open and Caleb emerged, moving fast and low. He'd positioned himself behind the water trough, rifle ready. His first shot knocked a rider from his saddle. The man crawled behind a boulder, clutching his shoulder. "The house!" one of the attackers shouted. "Get the woman!" 2 riders charged toward the cabin. Clara fired again, this time catching one horse in the flank. The animal screamed and bucked, throwing its rider into the dirt. But the second man kept coming, leaping from his horse onto the porch. Clara barely had time to bar the door before he slammed into it. The wood groaned under the impact. She backed away, reloading with trembling fingers as the door shuddered again. Through the window, she saw Caleb trying to reach the house, but the remaining attackers had him pinned. The door splintered on the third hit. The man who burst through was massive, with mean eyes above his bandana. Clara fired, but he was already moving, knocking the rifle from her hands. She grabbed the iron poker from the fireplace and swung it with all her strength. It caught him across the ribs, drawing a grunt of pain. "Feisty little wildcat," he snarled, lunging for her. Clara danced back, keeping the table between them. Her mind raced, calculating distances, weapons, escape routes. The man feinted left, then right, trying to corner her. She grabbed the coffee pot from the stove, still hot from morning, and flung it at his face. He howled, pawing at his eyes. The distraction was enough. Clara snatched a kitchen knife from the table and held it steady. "Get out of my house!" The man's eyes above the bandana promised violence, but before he could move, a gunshot exploded behind him. He stiffened, then toppled forward. Caleb stood in the doorway, smoking rifle in hand, his face carved from stone. "You hurt?" he asked tersely. "No." Clara's voice came out steadier than she felt. "Good. Stay down." He was gone again, back into the fight. Clara retrieved Thomas's rifle and took position at the window. The battle had turned. With one man down and another wounded, the attackers were retreating. She saw Jake Tolliver helping the wounded man onto a horse, shouting curses and threats. "This ain't over, Morrison," Tolliver's voice carried across the yard. "That woman's sitting on prime land, and one way or another, we'll have it." Caleb's answer was another rifle shot that sent Tolliver's hat flying. The rustlers spurred their horses and fled, leaving dust and gun smoke in their wake. In the sudden silence, Clara heard her own ragged breathing. Her hands shook now that the immediate danger had passed. She stepped over the dead man in her doorway and into the yard, where Caleb was checking the grounds with methodical precision. "They'll be back," he said without preamble. "Probably with more men." "I know." She looked at the damage. Bullet holes in the barn wall. Dead chickens scattered across the yard. Her door hanging broken on its hinges. Rage built in her chest. Hot and cleansing. "They want my land." "It's good land. Water rights. Decent soil." Caleb reloaded his rifle as he spoke. "Garrett's been buying up property all around here. Guess he figured a widow would be easy pickings. He figured wrong." Caleb looked at her then, really looked at her. Standing there with her hair half undone, dress torn, still gripping the rifle, and something shifted in his expression. "Yes," he said quietly. He surely did. The sound of approaching horses made them both tense, but it was Sheriff Watson who appeared, accompanied by half a dozen townsmen. They'd come armed but late, as usual. "Heard shooting," Watson said, surveying the scene with obvious reluctance. He was a small man who'd gotten his position through politics rather than skill, and it showed. "Rustlers attacked Mrs. Whitfield's property," Caleb said. "That's one of them there." He indicated the body. Watson dismounted slowly, as if hoping the situation might resolve itself before he reached it. He pulled down the dead man's bandana, revealing a face none of them recognized. "Drifter, probably," Watson concluded quickly. "No way to prove he was with any gang." "Jake Tolliver was here." Clara interjected. "I saw him clear as day. He was riding his bay mare. Now, Mrs. Whitfield." Watson's tone turned condescending. "You were probably frightened, confused. Easy to make mistakes in all that excitement." "I know what I saw?" Clara's voice cut like winter wind. "Just as I know you'll do nothing about it. Sheriff, you never do when it comes to Garrett and his men." Watson's face flushed. "That's a serious accusation, ma'am. No more serious than 5 men attacking a woman in broad daylight." She stepped closer, and Watson actually backed up. But don't trouble yourself, mister. Morrison and I will handle our own defense." The sheriff looked between them, taking in Caleb's protective stance near Clara. "Morrison, you fixing to stay out here?" "I am." "People are talking." "Let them talk." Caleb's tone suggested the conversation was over, after Watson and his men left, taking the body with them. Clara and Caleb worked in silence to repair what they could. They rehung the door, patched the worst bullet holes, and gave the dead chickens a decent burial. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, they finally stopped to rest on the porch steps. "Thank you," Clara said simply. "You saved my life today. You were doing pretty well on your own." Coffee Pot was inspired. Despite everything, she found herself almost smiling. "Mother always said to use what's handy." "Smart woman." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Clara, Mrs. Whitfield, this is going to get worse before it gets better. Garrett won't give up, and Watson won't help. You could still, if you're about to suggest I leave, save your breath." She met his eyes squarely. "This is my land. Thomas and I worked too hard for it, dreamed too much on it. I'll die before I let them take it." "I know." His voice was soft. "That's what worries me." The admission hung between them, weighted with more than concern for a friend's widow. Clara felt her heartbeat quicken, aware suddenly of how close they sat, how the fading light caught in his weathered features. "Why do you care what happens to me?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Caleb looked away, toward the mountains where the last sun rays crowned the peaks in fire. "Thomas asked me to look after you, if anything happened." "Is that all?" He was silent so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "No, that's not all." Clara's breath caught. She waited, but he said nothing more, just sat there solid and steady beside her as darkness crept across the prairie. In the distance, a nighthawk called, its cry echoing the loneliness that had filled her days for so long. "The Henshaw place," she said finally. "You really thinking of buying it?" "Already did. Signed the papers yesterday." He glanced at her, figured it was time to stop drifting. The implications settled over her like a warm blanket. Caleb Morrison, putting down roots. Next door, the future suddenly held possibilities she hadn't dared imagine. "It's good land," she managed. "Yes." He stood, gathering his rifle. "I should check the perimeter before full dark." Clara watched him walk away, his silhouette merging with the gathering shadows. Inside the cabin, she lit the lanterns and tried to restore some order to her disrupted home, but her mind kept returning to that moment on the porch, to the weight of unspoken words. Through the window, she caught glimpses of Caleb's lantern as he made his rounds. The sight should have reminded her of danger, of the threat still lurking beyond her fences. Instead, she found comfort in it, in knowing she wasn't alone, that someone stood watch in the darkness. The night wind rose, rattling the patched door and whistling through the bullet holes they'd missed. Clara added wood to the stove and settled in her chair with her mending, rifle close at hand. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, perhaps another attack. Garrett wouldn't give up easily. And 5 dead chickens were a small price for men who dealt in stolen cattle. But tonight, with Caleb Morrison keeping watch and her land still hers, Clara allowed herself a moment of fierce satisfaction. They'd come for her, and she'd fought them off. Let the town gossip. Let Watson turn his blind eye. She'd survived worse than rustlers and small-minded neighbors. And maybe, just maybe, she'd found something worth more than survival in the process. The whispers started as a trickle and grew to a flood. Clara couldn't step foot in town without feeling the weight of judgmental stares and hearing conversations halt mid-sentence. At the general store, women she'd known for years suddenly found urgent business elsewhere when she approached. Their message was clear. A widow who allowed a man to stay on her property had crossed an unforgivable line. "Shameless," she heard Mrs. Henderson hiss to her daughter as Clara selected flour. Her poor husband barely cold in the ground. Clara's hands tightened on her basket, but she kept her head high. 2 years. Thomas had been gone 2 years. How long was a woman supposed to wear grief like a shroud? At the post office, even mild-mannered Mr. Jeffries could barely meet her eyes as he handed over her mail. "Mrs. Whitfield," he mumbled, then added hesitantly, "Reverend Michaels asked me to remind you about Sunday services. Said he hasn't seen you in a while." The implication stung. Clara had attended church sporadically since Thomas's death, finding little comfort in platitudes about God's plan. Now, it seemed, her absence was being noted and judged alongside her other sins. She left town quickly, spurring her mare perhaps harder than necessary. The prairie wind whipped her hair free from its pins, and she let it fly. Let them see her riding like a hoyden. What difference did it make now? Back at the cabin, she found Caleb repairing the chicken coop. He looked up at her approach, his expression darkening as he took in her rigid posture. "Bad?" he asked simply. "The usual." She dismounted, trying to keep the hurt from her voice. "Apparently, I'm fallen woman now. Mrs. Henderson made sure everyone in the store knew it?" Caleb set down his hammer carefully. "Clara, if my being here is causing you grief—" "No." The word came out fiercer than intended. "They've been waiting for an excuse to condemn me since Thomas died. A woman alone who won't sell her land, won't remarry the first man who offers, won't bow and scrape and beg for their protection. I was already an oddity. Now I'm a scandal." "You could make it stop," he said quietly. "Tell me to leave." Clara met his eyes. Seeing the pain there, he would go if she asked. Would ride away to protect her reputation, even if it killed something in him. The nobility of it made her chest ache. "Could I?" She stepped closer. "Would that really change anything? They'd find another reason to whisper. I'm tired of living for their approval, Caleb, tired of being less than I am to make them comfortable." He watched her approach, standing very still. "What do you want, Clara?" The question hung between them, loaded with possibility. What did she want? Safety, respectability, the empty honor of a spotless reputation. "I want to live," she said finally. "Not just survive, not just endure. I want to wake up without dread, work my land without apology, and choose my own path without the town's permission. And if that path includes me," her heart hammered against her ribs, "then I'll walk it with my head high." Something shifted in Caleb's expression. A wall coming down. He reached out slowly, giving her time to retreat, and touched her cheek. His hand was calloused from years of work, but gentle as morning mist. "You deserve better than a broken-down cowboy with more past than future," he said. "You're not broken." Clara covered his hand with hers. "And everyone has a past. It's the future that matters." For a moment, they stood frozen, balanced on the edge of something irreversible. Then the sound of approaching horses shattered the spell. Caleb stepped back, hand moving to his gun as 3 riders appeared on the horizon. But it wasn't rustlers this time. Reverend Michaels led the group, flanked by Deacon Harris and Elder Jameson. Their faces wore the grim satisfaction of men on a righteous mission. "Mrs. Whitfield," the Reverend intoned as they reined in their horses. He was a thin man with sharp features that always reminded Clara of a hungry hawk. "We've come to speak with you about your situation." "My situation?" Clara kept her voice level, though anger simmered beneath. "This arrangement," Michaels gestured dismissively at Caleb. "A man living on your property, no chaperone, no proper boundaries. It's causing distress among the congregation. Mr. Morrison has been protecting me from rustlers." Clara said, "Unless you'd prefer I face armed attackers alone. There are proper ways to handle such things." Deacon Harris interjected. He was a banker by trade, soft and prosperous, who'd never faced anything more dangerous than an unbalanced ledger. "You could hire hands, stay in town, comport yourself as befits a Christian widow." "A Christian widow." Clara tasted the words like bitter medicine. "Tell me, Deacon, where was Christian charity when I was hauling water in blizzards?" Where was congregational concern when I was mending fences with bleeding hands? You speak of propriety now, but I recall no offers of help when help would have truly mattered. Elder Jameson, oldest of the three, shook his head sadly. Pride, Mrs. Whitfield. It's always been your weakness, and now it's led you into sin. Sin? Clara's control finally snapped. You want to talk about sin? How about the sin of turning blind eyes to suffering, the sin of gossip and judgment, the sin of valuing appearance over truth? Enough. Reverend Michael's voice cracked like a whip. You will dismiss this man immediately and return to town where you can be properly supervised, or you will no longer be welcome in God's house. The ultimatum hung in the air like gun smoke. Clara felt Caleb tense beside her, ready to speak, but she touched his arm lightly. This was her fight. Reverend, she said with deadly calm, I have never felt less welcome in God's house than when surrounded by his supposed servants. If you believe the Almighty cares more about sleeping arrangements than kindness, more about reputation than righteousness, then your God and mine are very different indeed. Michael's face flushed purple. I dare to think for myself. I dare to survive against odds that would have broken your pampered souls. And yes, I dare to accept help from an honorable man without bowing to your narrow minds. She stepped forward, and the Reverend's horse shied back. Now get off my land. You'll regret this, Michaels promised. When you're shunned by all decent folk, when your name becomes a cautionary tale, at least it will be my name. Clara interrupted. My choice, my life, that's more than most women in your congregation can say. The three men left in high dudgeon, dust swirling in their wake. Clara stood watching until they disappeared, then felt her knees go weak. Caleb caught her elbow, steadying her. That was magnificent, he said quietly. Also possibly unwise. Probably. She laughed, surprising herself. But oh, it felt good. I've been wanting to say that for 2 years. What will you do now? They'll make good on their threats. Clara considered the question. Being cast out from the church meant more than losing Sunday services. It meant social exile, being cut off from the community's support network, becoming truly invisible. I'll do what I've always done, she decided. Work my land, pay my debts, and live by my own conscience. If that makes me a pariah, so be it. Caleb studied her face. You're sure? I'm sure of very little anymore, she admitted. But I know Thomas wouldn't want me to shrivel up in fear of whispers. And I know. She paused, gathering courage. I know I don't want you to leave. Clara. Her name on his lips was prayer and promise combined. Are you certain? Because if I stay now, after this, there's no going back. The talk will only get worse. Let them talk. She met his gaze steadily. I've made my choice. He nodded slowly. Then I should tell you, I've been thinking about more than just protection. The Henshaw place needs work, but with both properties combined, we could run a real operation, cattle, horses, maybe even some farming in the valley. It would take partnership, planning. He paused. A future. The word hung between them. Golden with possibility. Clara's heart raced as she understood what he was really offering. Not just land management, but a life together. Building something lasting on the prairie that had taken so much from both of them. Caleb Morrison, she said with a slight smile. Are you proposing a business arrangement? Among other things, he replied, his own smile warming his weathered features. Though I figured we might take things in proper order, seems I've caused enough scandal for one day. As if to punctuate his words, the evening sun broke through the clouds, painting the grassland in shades of amber and gold. The prairie stretched endlessly around them, but for the first time in 2 years, Clara didn't see emptiness. She saw possibility. Then we'd better get to work, she said. Spring will be here before we know it, and there's much to do. They stood together as the light faded, planning and dreaming while the wind carried the scent of coming rain. Tomorrow, the town would buzz with fresh gossip. The Reverend would preach about fallen women and the wages of sin. But here, on land she'd fought to keep, with a man who'd stood beside her against more than rustlers. Clara felt the first stirrings of something she'd thought lost forever. Peace, purpose, and perhaps, if she dared to name it, love. The night erupted in flame and fury. Clara woke to the acrid smell of smoke and the terrible crackling of fire eating through dry wood. Orange light danced across her bedroom walls, and for a moment, she thought she was dreaming. Then Caleb's voice cut through the night. "Clara, get out! They're burning the barn!" She grabbed Thomas's rifle and her coat, racing outside in her nightgown and boots. The barn was already engulfed, flames leaping 30 feet into the darkness. The horses were screaming, trapped inside. "The animals!" She started toward the inferno, but Caleb caught her arm. "Too late! Stay back!" His face was grim in the firelight. "Watch the cabin. They'll use this as cover," as if his words were prophecy. Riders materialized from the smoke. 6, 8, maybe 10 men, bandanas covering their faces, guns drawn. Jake Tolliver led them, his bay mare dancing nervously away from the flames. "Give it up, widow," Tolliver shouted over the roar of the fire. "Sign the deed over to Mr. Garrett, and we'll let you leave with your life." "Go to hell!" Clara raised the rifle, but there were too many of them, spreading out to surround the cabin. Caleb had taken position behind the well, his rifle spitting fire. One attacker fell from his saddle, clutching his leg, but more kept coming, using the smoke and chaos as cover. "The cabin!" someone yelled. "Burn her out!" 2 riders with torches charged toward her home. Clara fired, missed, fired again. 1 torch went flying, but the other man reached the porch. She watched in horror as flames began to lick at the wooden supports she and Thomas had raised with such hope. "No!" The word tore from her throat as she rushed forward, heedless of the bullets whining past. The rider laughed, tossing his torch through the broken door. "Should have taken Garrett's offer, woman." Caleb appeared from the smoke like an avenging angel, yanking the man from his horse and sending him sprawling with a fierce blow. But the damage was done. Fire was spreading through the cabin, consuming her memories, her life. "Clara, get to cover!" Caleb shouted, but she was already moving, not away but toward the burning cabin. "My mother's Bible," she gasped. "Thomas's papers, leave them!" But she was already at the door, smoke stinging her eyes, heat searing her lungs. The main room was a wall of flame, but she could see the chest in the corner where she kept her precious few mementos. If she could just... Strong arms wrapped around her waist, hauling her backward. "Damn it, Clara, no!" They tumbled onto the ground as the roof beam crashed down where she'd been standing. Caleb rolled them away from the heat, shielding her with his body as burning debris rained down. "Let me go!" She fought against him, wild with grief. "Everything's in there, everything!" "Not everything." His voice was fierce in her ear. "You're alive. That's what matters." The gunfight raged around them. Through tears and smoke, Clara saw townsmen arriving, not the sheriff, but others. Tom Brazier, one arm still in a sling, firing from horseback. The Perkins brothers from the neighboring ranch. Even old Charlie UN from the laundry, wielding an ancient shotgun with deadly accuracy. "Thought you might need help," Brazier shouted, dropping another attacker. "Saw the flames from my place." The tide turned quickly, outnumbered now and facing real resistance. The remaining attackers began to retreat. Tolliver screamed curses and threats, but his men were already fleeing into the darkness. "This ain't over," he bellowed. "Garrett owns this valley, and one way or another—" His words cut off as Caleb's bullet took his hat off, missing his skull by inches. Tolliver spurred his horse and vanished into the night with the rest. In the sudden quiet, Clara stood among the ruins of her life. The barn had collapsed into glowing embers. The cabin was a skeleton of flame-blackened timber. Everything she'd fought to preserve, gone in minutes. "Clara," Caleb's voice was gentle. She realized he was bleeding from a gash on his temple, his shirt torn and singed. "Don't..." She couldn't bear sympathy right now. "Just don't..." Tom Brazier dismounted, approaching carefully. "Mrs. Whitfield, I'm sorry we didn't get here sooner. You came. Her voice sounded hollow. That's more than I expected from anyone. Yeah, well, Brazier looked uncomfortable. Some of us been talking. What the Reverend did, turning folks against you, it ain't right. You've worked harder than any two men to keep this place going. Deserve better than gossip and judgment. Charlie Yuen nodded vigorously. You helped my daughter when she was sick, brought soup, sat with her. We remember. The Perkins brothers mumbled agreement, and Clara felt something crack inside her chest. These men, not the pillars of society, not the church elders, but working folk who understood struggle, had risked their lives for her. Thank you, she managed. Question now is what's next? Brazier said, Can't stay here tonight, that's certain. Clara looked around the smoking ruins. Dawn was breaking, revealing the full devastation. Her home, her refuge, her last connection to Thomas, all gone. But as the first rays of sun touched the prairie, she felt something unexpected. Not despair, but a strange lightness. The past had burned away with the cabin. All that remained was the future. I know Garrett was behind this, she said, steel entering her voice. Tolliver all but said so. Proving it's another matter, Brazier warned. Garrett's got money, connections. Then we'd better get proof. Clara turned to Caleb. You said Garrett's been buying up land all around here. There must be records, patterns. Someone talks when they're drunk. Someone sees something they shouldn't. Caleb nodded slowly. You're thinking of fighting back. I'm thinking of finishing this. She met the eyes of each man. They burned me out because they thought it would break me. They were wrong. Will you help? One by one. The men nodded. Even Charlie Yuen, who had more reason than most to avoid trouble with powerful men. My place is closest. Brazier offered. You can stay there while we figure this out. Mary'll be glad for the company. Clara accepted gratefully, though she noticed Caleb's jaw tighten. The impropriety of her staying at his place would be even worse than before. But what did reputation matter when you were standing in ashes? As the men organized the salvage effort, checking for survivors among the animals and saving what little could be saved. Clara walked to where her garden had been. The fire had spared it, and green shoots still pushed through the soil, life persisting despite destruction. Caleb found her there. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I should have expected this, posted more guards. Stop. She turned to face him. This isn't your fault. It's mine for believing I could fight them alone for so long. She touched his injured temple gently. You're hurt. It's nothing, but he didn't pull away from her touch. Clara, what you said about finishing this, I meant it. She looked back at the ruins. They took everything except what matters most. I'm still here. You're still here. And now we know we're not alone. He caught her hand, holding it against his cheek. When this is over, and it will be over, I want... He paused, struggling for words. I know. She did know, felt it in the way he looked at her, the way he'd pulled her from the fire. When this is over, it was a promise, spoken in smoke and morning light, a future worth fighting for. Mary Brazier welcomed them with tears and fierce hugs, installing Clara in her daughter's old room and fussing over Caleb's wounds. As Clara washed the soot from her face and changed into borrowed clothes, she could hear the men talking downstairs, planning. She paused at the mirror, studying her reflection. The woman looking back wasn't the grieving widow who'd stood at this same mirror after Thomas's funeral. This woman had steel in her spine and fire in her eyes, not the destroying fire of last night, but the forge fire that tempered metal into strength. They'd burned her out, but they hadn't broken her, and now she had allies, unexpected ones. The fight wasn't over. If anything, it had just truly begun. Outside, she heard Caleb's voice, steady and sure, organizing the investigation into Garrett's land grabs. Her heart quickened at the sound. When this was over? Indeed. Clara Whitfield squared her shoulders and headed downstairs. She had a home to rebuild, justice to pursue, and a future to claim. The fire had taken much, But it had also cleared the ground for new growth, and she intended to bloom like the prairie after a lightning strike, stronger and more vibrant than before. The days at the Brazier Ranch passed in a blur of careful planning and quiet recovery. Clara threw herself into helping Mary with household duties, finding solace in simple tasks while the men investigated Garrett's schemes. But it was the evenings that sustained her, when Caleb would return from town with news and they would walk together in the fading light. "We've found something," Caleb announced one evening, his eyes bright with triumph. "Charlie Yuen's cousin works at the land office. Garrett's been filing false claims, forging signatures. Tom tracked down 2 families who supposedly sold to him. They never heard of any sale." Clara's pulse quickened. "That's proof of fraud. Enough to interest a federal marshal, if we can get word to one." He paused, studying her face in the twilight. "How are you holding up?" "I'm managing." It was her standard answer, but Caleb saw through it. "Clara," just her name, but weighted with understanding. She sighed, leaning against the fence rail. "I dream about the fire. Wake up smelling smoke. Mary's kind, but I feel like I'm imposing, and I miss," she gestured helplessly, "having something that's mine." "The Henshaw place is half-built," Caleb said carefully. "Not much, but it's got walls and a roof. You could stay there." The offer hung between them, laden with implications. An unmarried woman staying in an unmarried man's house, even a half-finished one, would cement her ruined reputation forever. "Caleb, I know what I'm asking." He turned to face her fully. "I know what people will say, but I also know I can't stand seeing you diminished like this, accepting charity when you should be rebuilding your own life." "And what life would that be?" The question came out sharper than intended. "I have no home, no resources, nothing but the clothes Mary gave me." "You have land," he interrupted. "Insurance money will come, eventually. You have friends who'll help rebuild, and you have—" He stopped, jaw working. "What?" Clara whispered. "What do I have?" "Me." The word was rough, torn from somewhere deep. "If you want me, not just for protection or convenience, but—" "Clara, I've been half in love with you since Thomas first introduced us. Held it back out of respect for him, for you. But watching you these past weeks, seeing your strength, your fire, I can't pretend anymore." Clara's heart thundered in her chest. "Caleb Morrison, you pick the strangest times for declarations." "Maybe." A rueful smile touched his lips. "But nearly losing you in that fire clarified things. Life's too short and too hard to waste on proper timing." She studied his face, weathered by sun and wind, marked by the recent fight. This good man who'd stood beside her against everything, who offered not rescue but partnership. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes? Yes, I'll stay at the Henshaw place. Yes, I want to rebuild, not just the cabin, but everything. And yes," she reached out, touched his hand. "I want you. Have for a while now. If I'm honest." His fingers intertwined with hers, calloused and strong. "People will talk. Let them. I'm already ruined in their eyes. Might as well be ruined with purpose." He laughed, a sound that warmed her more than any fire. "Marry me." The proposal was sudden, lacking flowers or bended knee, but perfect in its directness. "When this is over," Clara promised. "When Garrett's in jail and I can stand at my own door again. Then yes, I'll hold you to that." He lifted her hand, pressed a kiss to her palm. "Now, let's go tell the others about staying at my place before I lose my nerve." The announcement was met with less shock than Clara expected. Mary Brazier just smiled knowingly, while Tom nodded approval. "Makes sense," Brazier said. "We're running out of room here anyway, and Caleb's place is closer to town for the investigation." Even Charlie Yuen seemed unsurprised. "Good match," he declared. "Both stubborn like mules. Need each other." The next morning, Clara packed her few borrowed belongings and rode with Caleb to the Henshaw property. The house was indeed half finished. More framework than home, but solid. Caleb had been working on it in spare moments, and she could see his care in every beam. "It's not much," he said apologetically as they entered. "It's perfect." Clara meant it. After the brazier's crowded warmth, the space felt like freedom. "We'll finish it together." They spent the day making it livable, hanging canvas over the unfinished walls, setting up a makeshift kitchen, creating separate sleeping areas for propriety's sake, though they both knew propriety had long since fled. That night, as they sat by the fire pit outside, watching stars emerge in the vast prairie sky, Clara felt peace settling into her bones. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more steps in their fight against Garrett. But tonight, she was exactly where she belonged. "Tell me about the future," she said. "After we win, after we rebuild." "What then?" Caleb leaned back, considering. "Horses. I think breeding program with those Mustangs that run wild in the canyon. Maybe some cattle, but horses are what I know best. The land's good for it." Clara agreed. "Thomas always said so. We could build something real here, something lasting. Caleb smiled. "I like the sound of that." They talked long into the night, planning and dreaming while coyotes sang in the distance. The half-built house sheltered them, promise of what would come. When Clara finally retired to her corner, she felt hope burning bright as any flame. The next days brought progress. Tom Brazier rode to Denver to find a federal marshal. Charlie Yuen's network of relatives gathered more evidence. Even some townspeople, shamed by the fire and Clara's unjust exile, began to speak up about things they'd seen and heard. Caleb spent his days split between investigation and construction, determined to make the house weatherproof before winter. Clara worked beside him when not helping Mary coordinate the legal efforts. Her hands grew new calluses, but her heart grew lighter. One evening, as they raised a new beam together, Caleb suddenly said, "Pack your things." Clara paused, confused. "What?" "That's what I'll say when this is over. When you're standing in your rebuilt cabin, trying to be sensible about timing and propriety." His eyes held hers, intense and warm. "I'll say, pack your things, you're mine, and I won't take no for an answer." Heat flooded Clara's cheeks. "That's rather presumptuous, Mr. Morrison. Maybe." He grinned, unrepentant. "But you'll come anyway. Confident, aren't you?" "About this, yes." He secured the beam with sure strokes of his hammer. "About us, absolutely." Clara found herself smiling, imagining that moment. The cabin rebuilt. Garrett defeated. The future spread before them clean as fresh paper. And Caleb, standing in her doorway with that determined look, claiming her as she'd already claimed him. "I'll probably argue," she warned. "For form's sake. I'd expect nothing less." He climbed down from the ladder, pulled her close despite the sawdust and sweat. "But you'll come?" "Yes," she whispered against his shoulder. "I'll come." The kiss that followed was their first real one, unhurried and deep, full of promise, when they finally parted, both breathing hard. Clara felt as if the world had shifted on its axis. "Soon," Caleb said roughly. "This will be over soon." It had to be, because now that she'd tasted this, partnership, passion, purpose, Clara couldn't imagine going back. The fire had burned away her old life, but from the ashes, something better was rising. That night, as she lay listening to Caleb working late on the house, Clara touched her lips where he'd kissed her and smiled. Let the town talk. Let Garrett scheme. She'd found something worth any fight, any scandal. Tomorrow, the federal marshal would arrive. Tomorrow, justice would begin its slow turn. But tonight, in this half-built house with this wholly committed man, Clara Whitfield was already home. The stars wheeled overhead, and somewhere in the darkness, a nightingale began to sing. Its voice rose sweet and clear, heralding the dawn that would surely come. Clara closed her eyes and slept deeply, dreaming not of fire, but of foundations, not of endings, but of beginnings. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time since Thomas died, Clara knew with bone-deep certainty that she would win, not alone, but together, always together. The day Marshal Bradford arrived from Denver changed everything. Clara watched from the Henshaw place as he rode into town with 2 deputies, their badges glinting in the morning sun. By afternoon, Garrett's empire had begun to crumble. He sang like a canary. Tom Brazier reported that evening, grinning widely. Soon as the marshal showed those forged documents, Garrett turned on everyone. Tolliver, the corrupt clerks at the land office, even Sheriff Watson, trying to save his own skin. Clara felt no satisfaction, only a weary relief. What happens now? Trials. Most likely, you'll need to testify about the attacks. The fire. Brazier's expression softened. But it's over. Clara, you won. She looked around the half-finished room where they'd gathered. Her friends. Her allies. The people who'd stood by her when the rest of the town turned away. We won, she corrected. All of us. As the others celebrated with whiskey and laughter, Clara slipped outside. The evening air was crisp, carrying the scent of sage and possibility. She found Caleb by the corral, watching the sunset paint the mountains crimson. "It's done," she said simply. Yes. He didn't look at her, but she saw his shoulders relax as if a great weight had lifted. "The insurance money will come through now. You can rebuild. I've been thinking about that." Clara moved to stand beside him. "Maybe I don't want to rebuild the same life. Maybe I want something different." Now he did turn, eyebrow raised. "Different how?" "Thomas and we tried to farm land that wanted to be ranch, tried to make it something it wasn't." She gestured toward the open prairie. "But you see it clear. This is horse country. Always has been." "Clara Whitfield, are you proposing a partnership?" "Among other things." She echoed his words from weeks ago, though I figured we might take things in proper order. His laugh was rich and warm. "And what's the proper order?" "First, we finish this house, make it a real home." She counted on her fingers. "Second, we combine the properties, start that horse breeding program. Third," she paused, suddenly shy. "Third?" he prompted, moving closer. "Third, you keep that promise, the one about telling me to pack my things." Caleb's eyes darkened. "That's a promise I intend to keep very soon." "How soon? How does tomorrow sound?" Clara's heart skipped. "Tomorrow I have to go to my land, see what can be salvaged. Then I'll come with you." His voice was rough with emotion. "And when you're standing there, trying to be practical about rebuilding, I'll say what needs saying." The next morning dawned clear and bright. Clara dressed carefully in her best borrowed dress, pinning her hair up properly for the first time in weeks. When Caleb saw her, his expression made her efforts worthwhile. They rode to her property in companionable silence. Clara steeled herself for the devastation, but seeing it again still hurt. The chimney stood alone like a gravestone, surrounded by charred timber and memories. "We could clear it in a week," Caleb said. "Dismounting. Start fresh." Clara walked slowly through the ruins, remembering. Here was where the table had stood, where she and Thomas had shared so many meals. There, the bed where he'd breathed his last, the stove she'd fought so hard to keep lit through bitter winters. "So much life happened here," she murmured. "And more life will happen." Caleb joined her in the ashes. "Different life, but good." She turned to him, seeing the future reflected in his steady gaze. "Yes," she agreed. "Good life." He took a breath, and she saw him gathering courage. "Clara." "Yes?" "Pack your things." His voice dropped to that commanding tone that made her shiver. "You're mine." The words hung between them, fierce and tender at once. Clara felt tears prick her eyes, not of sorrow, but of overwhelming rightness. "I don't have any things to pack," she pointed out, gesturing at the ruins. "Then come as you are." He stepped closer, framing her face with his hands. "Just come. Be mine as I'm already yours. Build something new with me on this land that's seen too much sorrow." "Caleb Morrison," she whispered. "That sounds remarkably like a proposal." "It is." He dropped to one knee right there in the ashes, pulling a simple ring from his pocket. "I bought this weeks ago in Denver. Been carrying it, waiting. Clara Whitfield, you've shown me what real strength looks like, what real courage is. Marry me. Let me spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you." Clara looked down at him, this good man kneeling in the ruins of her past, offering a future brighter than any fire. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain. "Yes, I'll marry you." He slipped the ring on her finger and rose, crushing her against him. The kiss that followed tasted of promises and prairie wind, of endings and beginnings perfectly entwined. When they finally parted, both laughing and crying, Clara noticed riders approaching. Her heart clenched until she recognized them: Tom and Mary Brazier, Charlie Ewan, the Perkins brothers, even Reverend Michaels looking thoroughly chastened. "Heard you might be out here," Tom called. "Thought you should know. The town council met. They want to make amends, help you rebuild." Reverend Michaels dismounted. Hat in hand, "Mrs. Whitfield, I owe you an apology. I let pride and narrow thinking cloud my judgment. You've shown more Christian virtue in adversity than I have in comfort. Would you allow me to perform your wedding, if there's to be one?" Clara felt Caleb's arm tighten around her waist. She looked at the Reverend, seeing genuine remorse in his weathered features. The Clara of months ago might have held the grudge, but that woman had burned away with the cabin. "There is indeed to be a wedding," she said graciously. "And yes, Reverend, you may perform it." The celebration that followed was impromptu but joyful. Mary Brazier wept happy tears while the men slapped Caleb's back and offered construction help. Even Charlie Ewan smiled his rare smile, pressing a small jade charm into Clara's hand for luck. As the sun climbed higher, plans took shape. The wedding would be simple, held right here on the land in 2 weeks' time. The community would help raise a new cabin, not just replacing what was lost, but building something better. The Whitfield and Morrison properties would be combined into one of the finest horse ranches in the territory. But first, there was a journey to make. "Where are we going?" Clara asked as Caleb helped her onto her horse. "You'll see," he said mysteriously, leading them not toward town, but into the wild country beyond. They rode for an hour through valleys painted gold with autumn grass, past stands of cottonwood and pine, following a trail only Caleb seemed to know. Finally, they crested a rise, and Clara gasped. Below lay a hidden canyon, its depths green with grass and centered by a clear spring. But it was the horses that stole her breath. A band of mustangs, at least 20 strong, grazing peacefully in what was clearly their secret refuge. "How did you find this?" she whispered, afraid to disturb the perfect scene. "Tracking strays last year, been coming back ever since, earning their trust." He pointed to a black stallion standing sentinel. "That's Eclipse. Best bloodline I've ever seen in wild stock. With him and some good mares, we could build something extraordinary." Clara watched the horses move like liquid grace across the canyon floor. "They're magnificent." "They're ours," Caleb corrected. "This canyon's on the combined property line. We'll leave them wild but protected. Bring in domestic mares when they're ready. In 5 years, Morrison horses will be known across the West." "Morrison horses?" Clara raised an eyebrow. "Not Morrison Whitfield?" "You'll be a Morrison by then, too," he reminded her with a grin. She laughed, feeling light as air. "So I will." They stayed until sunset, planning and dreaming while the mustangs grazed below. When they finally rode home through purple twilight, Clara kept looking back at the canyon, imprinting it on her memory. "Thank you," she said as they reached the Henshaw place, soon to be the Morrison place. "For what?" "For showing me that after fire comes new growth, for standing by me when everyone else turned away, for being stubborn enough to stay even when I tried to push you away." She reached across the gap between their horses, taking his hand. "For loving me. Always," he said simply. "Through fire and storm, gossip and gunfights. Always." They sat there, hands joined, as the first stars appeared overhead. Tomorrow would bring work, clearing ruins, finalizing plans, preparing for a wedding and a life together. But tonight, Clara felt perfect peace settling over her like a benediction. The prairie stretched endless around them, but it no longer seemed empty. Instead, it promised adventure and growth, challenges faced together and victories shared. The widow's weeds had blown away with the ashes. In their place stood a woman reborn, ready to embrace whatever came next. As they finally headed inside their half-built home, Clara looked back once more at the vast horizon. Somewhere out there, Eclipse ran with his herd, wild and free yet part of their future. The symbolism wasn't lost on her. She too had run wild with grief. But now she was choosing her path, her partner, her purpose. No regrets? Caleb asked softly, following her gaze. None, Clara said, and meant it. Only anticipation. He smiled and led her inside, where lamplight pushed back the darkness and the framework of their future rose strong around them. In 2 weeks, she would be Clara Morrison. But tonight, she was simply Clara, no longer defined by loss but by love, not by what had been but by what would be. The door closed on the past. The future beckoned bright as prairie stars. And Clara stepped forward to meet it, her hand in Caleb's, her heart finally, fully home. Thank you for listening to this Wild West love story. Where are you enjoying this tale from? Please comment below and let's connect. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Clara and Caleb's journey. Your support means everything.